Welcome to Cobh in County Cork for this volume of Dublin Book Festival's Departures. We've left the capital behind us and are touring the land, seeking musicians, poets and writers to find out about the landscape that inspires them.
Oh, it's hugely important. It's generative ground which all of my work comes from.
But you have to sit down and just listen to the birds and feel the heat, even smell the blossoms.
And I think that's what nature writing does, landscape writing does. It helps others see.
I've never thought to think about it in that way before. It changes the world. It changes that square inch of landscape that we're looking at.
Exploring is huge for me. I don't think you're going to find stuff unless you go and explore.
The landscape of County Cork contains multitudes, from the fertile farms of the heartlands to the rocky peninsulas of the rugged western shores. But today, I'm in a place that melds islands, sea and man-made landscapes, so the gateway to the Atlantic, Cobh. And I'm here to talk about the impact of landscape on the work of the memoirist and poet and short story writer Alice Taylor and the novelist and author Billy O'Callaghan. Billy, will you tell me about what land means to you and place?
Big question. I think the stories that I like to write, they tend to, they can't exist unless they're in somewhere particularly distinct. They have to be connected to the characters. The characters have to belong to the place. And in the past, over the years that I've been writing, I tend to write a lot about exile, isolation. For that reason, maybe I've written quite a bit about islands, which is a natural, I suppose, setup for isolation. The stories that work best are the ones that are really the most authentic, the ones that I find are drawn from personal experience. There was a time when I was, maybe the first few years that I was writing, I was just making things up. And it was as I started to draw the work more out of myself that the work became better and better, more authentic. And it was a search for maybe a kind of a truth, I think, that I was looking for. Landscape is part of that. Landscape shapes the people. But really it's the people are the thing. It's just that they belong to particular places.
So it's to do with memory and then connecting with truth, and somehow, as you say, that's embodied in people and those people are in places. So
memory is the starting point. But when you're writing, you want it to be distinctive. You want it to be visual. I have to be able to see it to write it.
It's a bit like painting a picture, Billy, isn't it?
Well, I suppose the better you know your story,
Yes.
the more solid it will be, and the background is the place. Maybe the place is what gives you your foundation. But it's the characters. It's the characters that kick it off. I mean, I could probably talk more specifically about particular work. Rather than just generalising it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like the novel that I've just written now, Life Sentences, it starts, it jumps in terms of time. So it opens in the 1920s. Then it goes back to, it actually goes back to just after the famine, and then it comes forward to the 1980s. For the most part, it's set in Douglas Village, which is where I'm from. It's where my family have have been for a good many years. But the real beginning of the story, which goes back to the famine times, would have concerned my great grandmother, and she came from Cape Clear, and she made her way across in the aftermath of the famine, the devastation that area suffered, and she made her way eventually to Cork, and a pretty tough life. So what she carried with her was memories of Cape Clear, of a particular Cape Clear, a particular time, and when I was writing the book, I was thinking of stuff that my grandmother had told me. I grew up with my grandmother. We lived together until I was about 7, and she would just tell me stories about her father, her grandmother, which is my great-great-grandmother. And so it was when I started to write the book, it was really trying to salvage that, what I was after. Little things that had made it down, and I suppose it was the authentic was what I was trying to.
And grandmother's great.
They're fantastic.
Yeah.
My grandmother I was the only child in the house for a few years, and my grandmother would keep me at home from school to tell me stories. She would sit by the fire and she'd say, "The child is too sick to go to school today. leave him at home." And she'd tell me about the Black and Tans, and she'd tell me about her father who she adored, and he had fought in the Boer War. Then he came out of the army, had his family, and then when the First World War broke out, he enlisted again and went off to the Somme and Flanders, survived that and came home and lived out his days. And I remember she used to say he died with a smile on his face, and she thought he was the best man that ever walked through the village of Douglas. But it was only when I was, prior to writing the book, but when I was thinking about how I would do it, that I discovered he was born in the workhouse, and so that opened up a whole new a whole new direction for the book. So when you think of all the things that the man had to endure in his life, to die with a smile on his face is a nice achievement, I think.
Were you to get that insight, like to get going right back? Yeah.
And my grandmother died when I was about 7 years of age. So that's what I am pulling from, the first thing that I tried to write, the reason I first attempted to write was I wanted to get down a story that she had told me when I was a little boy, and I couldn't do it for a long time. I tried and I failed, and about 4 or 5 years ago I finally got the story written, and it was in my last collection of stories. It was called A Death in the Family, and it was really a key story for me. Not so much finishing it, but it was a story that this was sort of my white whale, that I was hunting for a long time. So that was the gift I was given, was a grandmother with stories to pass on to me.
Well, your grandmother was right. You learned more at home than you would have done if you'd gone to school.
Well, there's no fear of that.
It's true though, isn't it?
Yeah, you see it.
I know. Yeah. And maybe just in the last COVID year, a lot of people are realising that, aren't they? That actually when you have the children home, you tell them stories. But Alice, how did you have that realisation? Like back in the 80s, when there was a few select people, folklorists and people saying there's value in the past, but they were a tiny minority. And somehow you managed to put the stories of your past into a form that we all realise this is important.
Yeah, I suppose I grew up, I mean, Billy was in the city, I was in the heart of rural Ireland. We were 3 miles from the nearest town on the Cork-Kerry border, and roving, scraping in other parts of the country. We called it roving, I don't know why, but the neighbours would come at night and they would sit around the fire telling stories. And we loved the stories. I mean, they were made up and tall stories and everything, but I think we got a sense of storytelling was so important. And then when Billy was talking there about his grandmother, my grandmother lived back the road from us. Now, my grandmother was no pushover, you know, she was tough. And, but in a way, looking back, my grandmothers, they were the first generation after the famine, so they had to be tough. And her husband died when she was young, so she ran the farm, and she ran it like, and she wasn't a cuddly, you know, she was a finger up to us, and but she was there at the time of Black and Tans, and she told us, she sat at by the fire with a shawl around her, and I think when she was 70, she decided, this was it, I'm going to die. She didn't die till she was 98. So she was 28 years sitting by the fire. But she was always telling stories. And, you know, afterwards I regretted, we didn't listen to her at all, like, because we were young and we were flying in and out. But some of the stories, a bit like your grandmother, Billy, still stayed. And she oh God, she was mad Republican, like. And my uncle would go to the creamery, and he'd bring home the paper, the Irish Press, of course, and and I was small, but she'd say, give me that paper till I see what all Brooper is saying today. So she was not politically correct, like, and my father would have been the other side of the coin, like, so there was a bit of friction, so we had the two things. But I remember she told us one night about the Black and Tans. She was raided, of course, because she'd be hiding the boys, and her nephew was out, and so he was in the house, and but she didn't quite know where he was, like, and they were all in bed, and they had the lorries come into the yard, so she stalled as long as she could, and but they didn't say anything because they knew they'd be listening at the door. So she opened the door, and they came in and they searched everything, and she thought, where is he? She wasn't quite sure where he was. And so she always took great pride in telling us that one of the Black and Tans said to her, you remind me of my grandmother. Well, she said to him, your grandmother mustn't be up to much to rear a black ad like you. He could have shot her. But there was an old settle in the kitchen, you know, that rolled out, and your man was gone into the settle. And of course the Black and Tans didn't know what it was, and he'd been watching out, so he was okay. But she did it. She didn't get frightened. But she was a tough woman. Like, she didn't get. She was the only woman in our locality that killed her own pig.
Whoa!
And that was a fair barbaric exercise. She had to.
With a knife or something?
Yeah, because there was no one, whatever had to be done, she did it. Because there was, the children were young when her husband died. And if I remember she told us about a heifer, which was a very valuable part of the farm, broke his leg, and she fixed it, spliced it, and the vet came later and he said, as good a job as if I did it myself. So she was well able, like.
And we think of you now connected to Shannon in Cork, but as you say, you're from the Cork-Kerry border, the Sliabh-Luachra area or not?
Yeah.
Really?
Sliabh-Luachra, yeah. Well, of course, when I was growing up, we were kind of in Sliabh-Luachra, so we didn't know we were in Sliabh-Luachra. But
Will you tell me what is Sliabh-Luachra? I never understood.
Well, you see, there's no boundaries. It's kind of the Cork-Kerry bit of Limerick. It's the music, really, and the tradition and the storytelling. That's what it is, and the screek thing, really, like. But the traditional Irish music.
What's the screek thing?
Oh, screek thing is visiting in the formal sense. Screek thing, have you heard the screek thing, Billy? No, that was when at night, we called it roving, but that's called the screek thing as well. The neighbours came in, there was no official invitations, and people rambled. There were 7 houses in our town land, and people rambled around between the 7 houses. There was no such thing as invitation, but you just assumed you were welcomed, you know. It was a bit like a commune, really, all the children touring out of a couple of fields between us. And of course, we all went to school then through the fields, the different families, and we came along the valley, and there was a little stone bridge, and I always think we had the first telephone, because the first family put a stone on the bridge, and the next family put a stone on the bridge, and the next family put a stone on the bridge. So I thought afterwards, that was the first telephone. Now we're on the internet. I think we're a great generation, you know, my generation. We're after spending an amazing era, really.
Yeah. Well, do I understand the stone on the bridge? I don't understand that reference.
Yeah, the stone, you see, each family had their own stone. So you knew when you came along that the O'Neills were gone ahead of us.
To school.
To school, yeah.
Brilliant.
So that was that was our communication level. So that was the first stone telephone.
You know, somehow you have managed to share, to almost encompass our entire folk history within your books. But I had never realised you were from Sliabh Luachra, and that makes so much relevant, because I'm still struggling with Sliabh Luachra. Seems to be a place of mind. It's a place that kept our ancient essence. And so all of your memories from that place almost, they chime with all of ours. Like I'm still bowled over by that whole Sliabh Luachra.
Yeah, you see, we had you know, there was if there was somebody, the Yanks were home, there was a concert. Well, it wasn't a concert, it was a gathering, like, and we were all there were 7 of us in the family, and everybody was expected to sing or play, do something, whether you could or not. That had nothing to do with it. We provided our own entertainment. Everybody sang, and they played the gadget, as it was known as, or the violin, and so there was concerts, or the stations there the night of the threshing. There was a gathering, and it was all self-entertainment. There were house dances as well, you know, and then immigration was huge. Of course, they all went to, the girls went to New York, Boston, the boys went to Oregon, sheep herding, and when they came home, then there was the Oregon men's dance. That was a big occasion, the Oregon men's dance. And when they came home from Oregon, they had these big hats, the Oregon men's hats. We used to think that was very impressive. And they had these big leather boots, you know, laced up to their knees. But those young fellas, when you think of it, they grew up with big families. You know, there were big families that time. Those young lads came down here to Cobh and headed off for America. It took 6 weeks to get there. And you know, the American wakes, sure, it was a wake, like it was a grieving, but they turned it into a concert. There was a big gathering and a concert night. They left from out there on the pier, any moor symbolises it all. So they went off, and then they went out onto some of those young fellas went out sheep herding. They were out there for 6 months in the prairie on their own. And I remember there was a lad working with us, and he loved traditional Irish music, but we were teenagers and we loved the BBC Dick Barton Special Agent, and there was always a struggle about it, and he wanted the music. So he was only about 18, I say, and he went, and I remember he sent a postcard from Cobh of 3 little girls, and on the back of it was, "He can listen away to Dick Barton now," because he was gone, you see. But he went out on the play, but he was a musician and he used to play the melodeon. And I remember years and years afterwards going out to Oregon and meeting him and saying to him, I want to go out to see where you were. And he said only for the music he'd have gone crazy. Wow. Yeah, he played music and he wrote poetry. And he said the music kept him sane because the isolation. And the Irish weren't used to isolation.
When I go home, I walk the fields, the quiet fields where the warm dew had squelched between my childish toes, to sit beneath the cool oak and ash that sheltered my adolescent dreams. These trees stand with leafy arms outstretched like lovers, but not in passion, but with gentle sighs of contentment. I watch the cows graze peacefully by the river, curving its way through furzed inches into the woods beyond. This is a holy place, where men have worked close to God, each under the quiet heavens.
That way of life that you spoke of, you know, about the neighbours coming in.
Yes,
And
yeah.
When did that stop? When did that?
Television.
Okay.
Television.
Right.
You know, you see, we had the radio, but people can listen to the radio together.
Yeah.
But the television, it was like, I remember my grandmother, a television coming into my grandmother's house. My grandmother was dead at the time, but my uncle was there. And you know, when the television came first, we were nearly genuflecting to it. I mean, it was marvellous. But I remember going back to visit him, and I had left home at that time. And I said, "You've no television, Uncle Dan?" Oh, he said, "I have." And he opened this big kitchen press, and it was inside in the press. I said, "What's it doing in there?" Because everybody, he said, "We better keep our eye on that fella now." He said, "He could take over our lives." And all right, I often thought of matters. I have my television inside in the press. He was, at the time, like, we thought it was ridiculous, but he was right. Yeah.
And now for some music by Cork's Jack O'Rourke, accompanied today by Aisling Fitzpatrick.
Hi, I'm Jack. This is Aisling Fitzpatrick on cello. This is a song I wrote last week called Sea Swimming.
Martha took her time like a perfect crime. Pale toes glisten on cool water, caressing little waves and drowning sin, confessing raw desire and diving in. I made a beeline for the brine, didn't think of the ice cold, healing all that pain in green and blue. Me and Martha, sun coming through. Sea swimming, heart willing, I'll dive with you into the dawn, cured and renewed in the tide reborn. Sea swimming, it's fitting, with sunlight dancing on your skin, naked as a morning with you again and again and again. Seaweed and musk like blind man's buff, feeling all the feels without warning. REM on our speakerphone, cockles and clams make undertones. The meeting of our water signs, laughing in the tide with no motive, waves that hurl us into one, something brewing, nearly begun. Sea swimming, heart willing, I'll dive with you into the dawn, cured and renewed in the tide reborn. Sea swimming, it's fitting, with sunlight dancing on your skin, naked as a morning with you. Sea swimming, it's fitting, I'll dive with you into the dawn, cured and renewed in the tide reborn. Sea swimming, it's fitting, with sunlight dancing on your skin, naked as a morning with you again time like the perfect crime. Pale toes listen on cool water, caressing little waves and drowning sin, confessing raw desire and diving in. I made a beeline for the brine, didn't think of the ice cold, healing all that pain in green and blue. Me and Martha, sun coming through.
Billy, that world that you come from, the Douglas, which is, you know, now I suppose it's a suburb of Cork City.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was a different place, was it, when you were growing up, or at least when you
It was. I mean, like it was probably starting to expand at that point. I was born in 1974, so it was starting to expand a little bit. But from the 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, when my parents would have been young, children, I suppose. My mother was born in the village, and my father was born in Grange, which was just up the hill, and it was completely rural at that point. My father was one of 16 children, and they didn't have running water until the mid 60s. They didn't have electricity until the late 60s. Even when I used to go up to my grandmother, the toilet was down in the back garden, and so there was a sense of the rural, even though we were, starting to be drawn into the city. And there was greenery around, and there was places to run and climb trees and slog apples and all that.
Wasn't she a great woman with 16 children?
She was, and both of my grandmothers were widowed in their probably mid-40s.
Oh my God.
And my grandmother, my mother's mother, who I lived with when I was a child, she had 4 children, but they were tough. I mean, they weren't kind of hard people, but they were just able to bear it. Like, one of the things that has always fascinated me, it's something that I try to get into a bit in my writing, is the things that nobody talks about. It's the kind of the silences. Like, I remember, if I called, back when you had to go to mass, I'd call into my grandmother, my father's mother, and she'd just be sitting by the fire in complete silence.
Yes.
No, and there was 16, but they were all moved out at that stage, and everyone would come to visit. Nobody moved far. There was always work in around Douglas, because we had 2 mills.
Oh yeah.
So it wasn't a place that there wasn't a huge amount of immigration from. Most people just worked in the local mills.
What were the mills?
There were woolen mills, and it was it was par for the course, really, that you left school after your confirmation. My father went into the mill at nearly 14, and that was life, and I don't think they had much ambition beyond it. They didn't really understand that there was more.
They didn't strive for anything beyond
they
what they
didn't
had.
really think there was
When
more.
you said there about your grandmother, the silence didn't bother her.
No, I suppose after a house with 16 screeching
was
children,
delighted with the
she was glad of a
silence.
bit of quiet. But she would be in the room, you nearly had to prize talk out of her.
Yes.
You'd come in and she'd sit there, and you could sit there for 10 minutes and she'd smile, but she wouldn't say an awful lot. And it was, that was something that fascinated me, because of the things that they had to bear. I think it was, when I was a child, I had a brother that he died as a baby, and he was up in Crumlin Hospital, And he used to, my father would come off night shift. He was working in Pfizer's at that stage in the factory. This was after the woolen mills had closed. And he and my mother they'd no car. This was 1979, 1980. And they would get the bus to Dublin, up to Crumlin. Yes. Then in the evening they would come back down. My father would have a bit of dinner and go off to work. And this went on for months, every night for months. And I remember standing at the window and just waiting to see him coming down the road. And they had, a kind of a frustrated silence about them.
I know.
It was something they couldn't even talk about. And then when my brother died, after that, it was never really mentioned for years and years, to the point where if you had asked me, I couldn't have told you when he was born, what his date of birth was, what his, his birthday, At Christmas time we'd go and visit the grave because he was in the grave with my grandmother, But that was it. It was never discussed, and I always thought it was to do with that it was just too painful a thing to talk about. Absolutely. You had to get on with things.
Yes.
And I think that's
But life was hard as well, like
absolutely
so they had to
hard.
Cope. And they had great coping skills in a sense.
Yeah, well, they did what it took.
They
did what it took
no
to survive.
And that wasn't because I had a brother. I was 6 and he was 4 when he died.
Yeah.
And he got meningitis, and it was something I never forgot. The sort of I remember the day he was taken out to be taken to the hospital, to the Bonds in Cork, and being up and there was no big, as you say, there was no big fuss but I can remember being up in the Grove and watching, because he was, we used to sleep together in the one bed like we were buddies, and when he went, I kind of knew this is the end.
Yeah.
The children have an innate sense, and a really old neighbour, Bill, that lived up the hill. And of course, Bill was he was one of the fellows that came scraping every night. Bill came every night, and he brought a bucket of water because we'd no running water. Right. He brought a bucket of water, and when we were calculating the water, we counted in Bill's bucket, and Bill came every night, and he loved us. My father was not a patient man, but Bill was a Santa Claus in our lives, and we used to say to my mother, "Why didn't you marry Bill?" And my father used to say, "If she did, he'd all die with the hunger," because he wasn't a good farmer. But Bill used to come and mind us. And I remember that night, Bill came down, and Bill was crying. And I knew, because a child could only judge, there was something terrible happening, but he died then, and I couldn't get it in, but I remember, of course there was devastation in the house because he was the youngest, and there was 5 girls in our family, and he was the baby, and there was, but it was a very, very difficult time, but like you said, it wasn't talked about that much. No. I said, my father, it wasn't discussed, of course the pain, but I remember my mother saying to me years afterwards, she said, I always regret it. She said, I grieved so long for Connie because there was all the rest of you, So they grieved silently, The grieving was done inside.
It was only years later that my mother, when I could ask her about, and actually I remember I came into the house one day and my mother was at the table and she was roaring, crying.
Yes.
This was now years later.
Yes.
And there had been a story in the news about, remember they were selling babies' organs out of Crumlin.
Yes.
And it just brought everything back to her, And so, at that point, then she started to talk a bit more about it, and she said one of the things was that she wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. My father and her brother just took the little coffin and buried it, had it buried, and it was so there wasn't a kind of I suppose a closure or. but it was never, it was for her own good. That's what they would have said.
It was what they knew at the time.
Yeah, it was the way of things. Yeah,
it was the way life was at that time.
So these are the things that leave an impression on you then when you.
You never forget them.
You don't.
They're inside your head. And isn't it amazing, Billy, when you start to write then? There's kind of cogs inside. Once you start to write about one thing, I found that when I was writing my first book, it's almost like a bit of a string inside in a press, and you pull it, and more comes, like, and it's all recorded in there. But I think that women are great to talk, and it's fine. And when we'd all gather. I mean, one of my sisters went to Canada, another Dina, but when they all came home, we sat around the table. We would talk for hours, like, and when the stories got told, and it was great, like, to, what one would forget, another one would remember. Yeah. So we and about the Yanks and all the different things. So then it's all there, but the storytelling brings it out then.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, it's trying to figure out, what it is that makes people function, and it's the things that they repress, and that's what I find that I'm trying to figure out when I'm writing a story. How much can one person endure and still go on? And I suppose I think people can go on when it's not that they're going on for themselves, but when they're going on for someone else. And that's generally. I mean, so when you spoke about your grandmother, and her husband dying, she had the children, she had to keep the show on the road, and that's it. I think that's that's.
Yeah, and I suppose they developed coping skills as well over the years. Like, we had an old man at home. He used to come he was a kind of a travelling farm worker. He came when it suited him, and he left when it suited him. Yeah. And the signal when he wanted to go was he'd say to my mother, "Give me my shirt, I'm going." That was her job, to wash his shirts. And I remember growing up, and I mean, we were on account of being all girls. We walked out on the farm, and we picked spuds and tin turnips and everything. But I remember being above in the break field, a big long field, which was actually the bread basket of the farm, and we'd look up at the big long drill, and we'd be complaining mad. And Dave used to say to us, "Head down, arse to the wind, and keep going." So that was the philosophy, like, and it was a philosophy for life. That was the way they handled life. Kept going.
But I think as well when and this is true all over the country, probably all over the world. It's the it's the small lives that are just enduring. I mean, there's great heroism.
There is. Unheralded.
I mean, they give medals to soldiers coming back from the war, but they don't give any medals for
to the wife that kept the home first.
Exactly. But at the same time, that's worth writing about. It's worth thinking about.
And that's what holds community together. And they need to be celebrated, because I remember in our village, I mean, we had the chapel woman. She was over 80. She opened the dispensary. She opened the chapel every morning, looked after the chapel, cleaned it, did the laundry. She did a little sweet shop, and she had a sister in a wheelchair. And I used to think, holy God, the amount of work that woman did. But she wasn't unique. Like, there were great women in Ireland long ago. They were powerful women. They kept the show on the road, like, and they were. I always think, farming women. They were the first of the working wives. They had chickens and hens and turkeys, and they made half the farm income. And they were. Well, I know now they didn't. Maybe they were deprived of a lot of rights, but often they held the purse strings. They were far more powerful than they got credit for, and often they were the boss silently. My father made all the racket, but my mother was the boss really underneath it, and we all knew that. Like, she'd say, "Ask your mother." So they weren't. They were fairly. They were very well acted.
And that idea of the trauma, of just the memory of the sadnesses that have happened. It's almost like when we think of the Irish male writers of the 20th century, like McGahern or even Tom Murphy, it all seems to be those unspoken things that the man can't say. And as you say, the woman was a little bit better at saying them, but maybe literature didn't look so much at what the women were doing. And what Billy, you seem to be able to write about the woman's perspective, and look, there's a whole new generation of women coming out talking about that. But I mean, I'm a man, I can't know, but I believe your women characters when they're trying to express this just powerful emotional loss and sense of keening and just sadness they deal with. But there's moments in both The Boatman and in Life Sentences, and as you said in a previous book, where this idea of the burying of children, or the burying of anyone, particularly children. And I realised, of course, that was so much of a part of our life, and the killing, where those losses are in the graveyards or in the killing, the unbaptised areas around it. Yeah. And there's something that we lose contact with. That's almost the trauma redolent in the landscape.
Yes, and the landscape is powerful.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at, I mean, the fairy forts, there was a fairy fort in our land. And I'd say way back, children were buried there, you know, before the formality of official Christendom. But I mean, the pagan rites are very basic to us, and they're still there.
They're only just under the skin,
That's all,
aren't
the
they,
holy
really?
wills and all these things. So they're part of what we were like and what we are really, you know. And the kindness of the landscape is there within our souls.
I mean, I suppose we're a funny kind of Christian.
We are.
You know,
I think, but we're interlaced with the landscape.
Yeah.
And I think that's the salvation of us. The church lost the run of itself, but I said the people didn't, you know, especially the country people that were near to the land, because there was a sacredness in the land, you know.
Yeah. I mean, if you know, I think if you know, down around West Cork, Bear, or you know, down that direction, you really have a sense of how small you are, how insignificant. I mean, the land is there forever, the sea is there forever,
we're only
the
passing.
sky, you know, the light is constantly changing, but it's, you know, and we're just fleeting.
We're only passing.
You know?
The night my father died, 8 generations of our family had lived on our farm. And the night my father was buried, I went down and I walked along the river with my brother. And I remember thinking, 8 generations have lived on the bank of this river. We're all gone, but the river is still there. You know, there's a solidity in the mountains and the rivers. We're only passing, and we're doing a fair bit of wreck in our passage. My father used to always say, wrong nature and we'll pay a terrible price. And of course we didn't know what he was talking about. Now I know what he was talking about. You know, he was fierce careful, and he was always planting trees and had great respect for trees. And he always said it took a tree a lifetime to grow, and a fool could cut it in 5 minutes. You know, so they were the two anthems he was always singing, and it was only afterwards I thought, God, he was right. We have wrong nature. So I think then the sooner we get back to respecting the countryside and the landscape and the mountains and the rivers, you know. But I think there's a new awareness developing. I think there is. Maybe Cobh has helped, you know. I think it's steadied us a bit.
Slowed us down a bit.
Yeah, we were after losing the run of ourselves a bit anyway. Yeah.
Did you get a sense of that, Billy, in your family, that there was there time to appreciate nature, or do you think your grandmother was too busy?
Well, I mean, from my father's side, even though there was 16 of them, they were always into drag hunting, you know.
Yes.
Some of his brothers still are. And so as children, we used to go to drag hunts. And
will you explain drag hunting?
Oh, drag hunting is, well, there would be a fella that, I mean, basically the rules of it would be 2 young fellas would be chosen. They'd have to, first of all, they'd have to walk the course in advance to mark out what the course was going to be. But they'd walk out into, you know, fields, and one would go one direction, the other would go the other direction, and they'd drag a rag dipped in a scent, kind of an aniseed scent, and it would be about 5 miles each direction. They'd come back in a loop, and then when they get back, they'd release the hounds, and the hounds would go off after they chased the scent, and they'd come around. And it's like a cross-country race for dogs,
And what you all chase the dogs, and the dogs.
No, people don't chase the dogs. The dogs chase the scent. They race.
You're being educated.
Yeah, and Aniseed, I'm still not done. So the dogs are trained.
The dogs are
to
trained to go for the scent. Yeah.
And you sit at home and you wait for
No,
dogs
you
to come
don't
home.
sit at home. I mean, there's fellas, they go out spotting, you know, they go out onto the country roads watching them coming over ditches.
And they love it. Here's telly home or something. And you probably have that expression, Bill, you know, if something was really smelly, they'd say, oh God, you could run and drag with it.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, it's not dying out. I mean, it's
still there.
Still going,
Oh, it's still there,
going.
yeah.
And it's big in the north of England as well. So, But I mean, I haven't been to one for a few years now.
They're special little dogs. They're kind of
well, they're harriers.
They're harrier dogs. Yeah.
I mean, they're bred like they're, you know, like a greyhound would be, or you know, it's it's big business.
It's a big thing in
Cork.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, in terms of countryside, that would be, you know, and also, I mean, Grange would have been where my father was when he was a child. It would have been very rural, you know. Actually, just recently he was talking about it, and he could name everybody that had lived within a 5-mile radius of when he was a child. He went through the whole, you know, out of boredom, I suppose.
Where they all lived.
And
that's very important, because otherwise we lose knowledge of the landscape as it was before it is now. Like.
Well, that's it. And you know, I mean, the place now is overrun with housing estates.
Oh yeah, houses, yes.
But I mean, you know, he would have, with 16 children, and he was the fourth. There was 2 girls, and then he had a brother, and then he was next. They would have to go out working for farmers from the age of, you know, 6 or 7, go up and milk the cows. And they'd get paid in spuds, or they'd chop down trees and sell the blocks, you know, from the back of a horse and cart, that kind of a thing. And I suppose it was just making ends meet, you know. Hard to figure out how to feed 16,
Oh yeah,
you know.
it was a lot,
I think my father, much more so than me now, would have been very grounded in the rural, you know. But he's always talking about it, so just.
Isn't it great that he did so?
Yeah.
Would there even have been the whiff of memory of Cape Clear? So, you know, that was your great grandmother. I think.
Yeah. Not really. I mean, my grandmother would have, like, she knew that she had come from there, that her grandmother had come from there, and one of the things that's actually in the book, she said, when she was leaving the island, that her mother used to say to her that they'd lived on the island 100 generations, and that when the last of them would leave, the island would collapse on itself, you know. And when she was coming across to Baltimore on the boat, she was afraid to look back, you know, and that was something that my grandmother had. You know, that little detail, whether it was something she had made up or what, I don't know, but that's what was given to me as, you know, as the story.
When I was a child, my mother often told me that we'd been hundreds of generations on Clear Island, one branch or another of us. And on the day the last one of us left, the island would sink out of grief to the bottom of the sea. And at 16, as I sat on the prow of the Sullivan Brothers boat, wanting more than anything to risk a backward glance, those words kept me afraid. For the entire crossing, my mother's voice sang loud inside me, and so truthful sounding that had I turned my head, I felt sure I'd see the cliffs crumbling in on themselves, and their blankets of gorse and heather flushing the stony grey waters with shades of purple and pink and gold. And worse still, that there'd be scatterings of my dead watching me from the strand, thin-shouldered and forlorn, knowing that I'd never return, that this was the end. Unclear, I knew the faces in every doorway and the family names that occupied every plot of graveyard earth. I knew the slopes and climbs of the fields where the best berries grew and where the ground birds nested. And I never slept a single night without the sighing of the running waves.
She never went back, you know, she never set foot on the place again.
Did she?
No, and her son never would have, you know. My grandmother never did, I'd say, you know. So it's, whatever connection was there was long gone, you know. But again, it's what shaped her.
And she handed it on to you.
Handed it on, you know, I suppose you have some feeling for it.
Yeah,
then,
isn't
you
it
know.
great? Isn't it amazing what's in the genes?
Sure, it is all in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's probably pharaohs in our genes if we go back far enough, you know. But
The fact that we, in one way we think we're disconnected from the famine and we don't need to think about the famine. But as you're saying, your grandmother remembers her grandmother saying it and it's still there.
Yeah.
And then if you're eight generations in Sliabh Luachra, in this Cork area border, there was famine memories there too.
That's right. And I mean, immigration was so big, and they came back. They always came back, you know, from America and Australia. And my father was very, even if there was hay down, and that's a big thing in the farm, if there was hay down, if the Yanks came, they'd be tea in the parlour. Yeah, they would be well looked after, because he kind of felt he owed it to the people who had immigrated. They had left, and these descendants were coming back, and so they were treated. It was a big thing when they came back. I'd say it was, you know, he felt responsible because he was in the home place. The home place is fierce important, because they all go out from the home place, and there's a great love of it. And you know, you could understand the Americans when they come back, that they're, you know, they want to walk the fields of where the ancestors came from. Of course, you know. And we have this old map in Shannon. There was a Brian McCarthy. He owned a Shannon hotel at one stage, and God bless him, he had great foresight. But one night there was a guy came into the grounds of the hotel with, I call him a hurdy-gurdy guy, you know the hurdy-gurdy guys. And he was selling stuff, and he had this old map. And Brian was smart, and he knew it was a huge importance to Shannon, and he bought the map off your man in 1970 something. He paid £350. That was a lot of money at that time, but it was a map of the village of Shannon and the surrounding townlands, and it was we dated it because the Catholic Church, which was built in 1829, was in it. The Church of Ireland, which was built in 1856, was not in it. So we again, and every house in the village was numbered, and the people who lived in it. And so Brian, he was leaving, they were selling the hotel and he was leaving, he brought it to me. He said, Alice, will you mind that if I don't come back from it? For it, he said, will you mind it? I said, I will. And we were restoring the church in Shannon then, and I was on the building committee. The only reason I wanted a wall from my map. So I said to the architect, I'm only here for one reason. I said I want a wall from my map, because it was 8 foot by 4 foot. It was a big map. And so it's up on the map in the back wall in Shannon. And when Americans come, you know, but it's great sometimes. I remember this family came, and she was, I remember her great, you know, with the Americans, they're Irish, but they could be great, I don't know how many great grandmothers are back along, but she said we were Mullins, and so I took them up. God, was she there on the map? Yeah. And she, well, God, could you give her? So in a way, these old maps, old records, and now our village, like Douglas now, it's changed. But I remember we bring out a magazine in Shannon every Christmas, in Shannon Candlelight, 38 years next Christmas, and we brought it out because I remember there was an old man died in the village, and I remember the day he died, God, I thought he's had to take the history of the village into the grave in his head. And I thought we must start Candlelight, and we started this magazine, and we kept going. and the records are in it. People wrote, and they said to me, what do we write? I said, whatever you like. We've got family histories and things. So it was a great documentation. Yeah. But a couple of years ago, I remember we had a barbecue in one of the pubs, fundraiser for Tiny Towns, and there was this American, a young lad from the village, but he spent all his life in America. He said to me, what? I can't remember. He said, when I grew up, the village was different. Well, can we walk around? And we remember the way the houses were. So we walked around. I thought, God, we'll forget. Like you know, Douglas, we'll forget the original village. Yeah. So anyway, I said, next Christmas, so I went around, and there was one man who had been born and reared in the village, went to school in the village. There's no substitute for a fellow that goes to school, because I'm a Blow-in and a Shannon, wouldn't have the same recollection, but this man had. He remembered every house, so we documented it all, and we put it in candlelight, and it's there now, preserved, you know, and it might be 30 or 40 years before people think, we've forgotten, but it won't be forgotten. Once it's written down, it's so important to write it down, Billy, isn't it?
And you know, older people as well, you know, what's in their heads is precious, really. Yeah. For, you know, that's what schools should be. They should be doing a lot more projects on archiving. You know, like in Douglas, you know, there are families that are in Douglas a good many, you know, generations. And they like Douglas is so big now, there's a lot of people that weren't from Douglas are living there now. But they would always say, oh, so-and-so, they're a cousin of so-and-so. So they would know, they'd know, you'd know the people that are kind of from Douglas are related to other people from Douglas, and they have 3 or 4 different strands of families. I remember one time, I mean, history is the span of history is very it's shorter than we think. I knew a woman, she was a translator from Polish into English, and her father was a professor in Oxford back in the 60s. And in his life, he had met somebody that had fought in the Crimean War and somebody that walked on the moon. So his lifespan spanned, you know, those 2 events. And, you know, that's the astonishing thing. You know, when you think of when you were a child, if you knew somebody that was really old, what they must have seen, you know, what their experience of the world was.
That's the great gift of both of your books, that not only like do the books give us enjoyment, but they give us these insights into ourselves, like into all of our past. And today, like by you sharing your personal stories, they chime with all of us, because it's that universal story of the people who survived on this island. So Alice and Billy, thank you so much for sharing that today.
It was great, wasn't it?
I'd say we were only getting going.
Landscape flashes, batten down the hatches, trees and streams, movie reels through windows on a train, shades of you, midnight blue, fall into the unknown. They don't fade away if you store them for a winter. They don't fade away. Gather all our embers. I wanna make love to you on a runaway train. No route or tracks of tears, just an open rolling plain. We'll crash into ocean, wrapped in waves of foam. Lost in you, you lost in me, our own way home on a runaway train. This train rolls in, we'll sigh and break. Your arched back against the city's break. Eyes of wine, telltale signs of shelter through the storm. Build a love nest, open fire, watch the flames transform. They won't burn out if you gather all our embers. They won't burn out if you keep them in our larder. wanna make love to you on a runaway train. No route or tracks of tears, just an open rolling plain. We'll crash into ocean, wrapped in waves of foam. Lost in you, you're lost in me, our own way home on a runaway train. It's a beautiful night, turn down that worry. It's a beautiful night, turn your face to the wind and sea. I wanna make love to you on a runaway train. No route or tracks of tears, just an open rolling plain. We'll crash into ocean, wrapped in waves of foam. Lost in you, you lost in me, our own way home on a runaway train. Landscape flashes, batten down